Welcome, everybody. Good to have you here. Welcome to the Westminster Town Hall Forum. I'm Tim Hart Anderson, the senior minister here at Westminster Church, and we're pleased to see you have come to hear Lisa Pruitt, but you've come to hear the Avalos Quartet as well, and you're in for a real treat. The Avalos Quartet is a group that began in 2017, so about 5 years ago, with a mission of lifting up BIPOC voices and composers. They're currently the emerging artists and quartet in residence for the Madeline Island Chamber Music Series. And they've been involved with the MacPhail Center for Music and the Graduate Resident String Quartet at Juilliard. They performed across the country. These folks get around and are popular in lots of places. They won in Davidson, North Carolina, the 2019 Young Artists Chamber Music Competition, and this year in Austin, Texas, they won the Coltman Music Competition. Please join me in welcoming to the Westminster Town Hall Forum the Avalos Quartet.
Hello everybody, good morning. We are the Avalos Quartet. We come all the way from New York City and we are very excited to be sharing this morning with you. We will be playing the first three movements of Beethoven String Quartet Opus 130, which is one of his late quartets. At first, these sets of quartets was criticized for being a little too crazy and out of the norm for string quartet writing. But today we have come to recognize it as really, really gorgeous music. So we hope you guys enjoy it. Thank you. Thank you so much. We would like to play one last piece for you guys, and it's a piece by African-American composer Jesse Montgomery, who lives in New York City, amazing violinist and amazing composer. The piece is titled Strum, and you will be seeing a lot of strumming during this piece. So. The piece was composed in 2012, I believe. Yeah. Thank you so much for having us today. It's our pleasure. We're the Valas Quartet. If you like the concert, we have Instagram, Facebook, and a website. You can follow us through there to find more concerts. And yeah, and we will be playing Saturday at the MacPhail Center and in Anthony Hall. We hope to see you there. Thank you.
I take it you like Diwalis. Good music. Greetings. Let's give them another round of applause. I told you you were in for a treat, and you were. Greetings. Welcome. Welcome to the Westminster Town Hall Forum. My name is Tim Hart Anderson. I'm the senior minister here at Westminster Presbyterian Church, located on Nicollet Mall in beautiful downtown Minneapolis, and I'm moderator of the forum. Today, we are pleased to welcome Professor Lisa Pruitt to the forum. For more than 40 years, Westminster Town Hall Forum has invited speakers of conscience to address issues of the day from an ethical perspective. This fall, we are presenting a four-part series called Healing Our House Divided. We have invited four intellectually diverse speakers to address American polarization. We've asked each one to offer ways to bridge our divisions and build a more respectful, pluralistic society. We invite you to visit our website, westminsterforum.org, to see the full lineup for this fall season, including upcoming talks by Chris Blattman on international peace building, and our program next month with former Attorney General Eric Holder. All these programs, including today's, are made possible because of individual supporters. If you are able, we would ask that you would consider supporting the Town Hall Forum. For those of you who are here in person, you probably received a donation envelope as you walked in with your materials. You may leave those with something inside if you'd like, at plates as you, I was going to say offering plates, that's the wrong thing. Baskets as you leave the building and leave the sanctuary. And those of you watching online, if you'd like to make a donation to support the forum, look at westminsterforum.org/donate, and you can make a gift as well. We're grateful to Minnesota Public Radio for recording and broadcasting all of our forums. NPR is presenting the Town Hall Forum's fall season as a special week-long series of programs. You'll be able to hear all four talks the week of December 5. One program will air each day at noon, including a live broadcast of Thursday, December 8th program. You can always watch or listen to the programs live on the Town Hall Forum website, as some of you are doing today, or our Facebook page. Thanks as always to our media co-sponsors, MinnPost, which is a source of nonpartisan news coverage of Minnesota and beyond. MinnPost has been running a series of opinion pieces about today's forum on the rural-urban rift. I've read some of their articles. It's fascinating what they're doing. You can find those stories and all their coverage at minnpost.com. Thanks as well to Sahan Journal, which is dedicated to covering issues affecting Minnesota's immigrants and communities of color. Learn more about them at sahanjournal.com. Both Sahan Journal and MinnPost are here with us today. They're going to be set up at tables outside the sanctuary following the forum. They, particularly MinnPost, is eager to ask you about what's driving your voting decisions this year. So if you want to express an opinion about that, MinnPost will be eager to listen to you. Stop by the tables outside the sanctuary after the program. In the second half of today's program, Professor Pruitt will be taking questions from the town hall. All of you here today, those of you with us in the sanctuary, should have a blank question card in your materials as you came in. Use that, if you would, to record a question, and then the ushers will pick that up during the Q&A. And if you're watching online, please join us in this conversation by posting your questions in the chat feature on the live stream, and we will do our best to collect those, and we'll present as many questions as we can. The Westminster bells. I just have to pause and let us listen to those. We just dedicated them a month ago, so I'm really into them. And now it's my pleasure to introduce today's Westminster Town Hall Forum speaker. Lisa Pruitt grew up in and has deep roots in rural Arkansas. That background informed her work as a lawyer and as a legal scholar. She's the founder of a sub-discipline in legal scholarship that explores rural-urban differences in how people engage law and the state. She studies the ways in which rural places are distinct from the implicit urban norm in which much of academia and culture and the media finds itself. She's the Martin Luther King Jr. Professor of Law at the University of California, Davis. Previously, she worked abroad in settings ranging from international organizations to private practice. She has worked with lawyers in more than 30 countries, negotiating cultural conflicts in various arenas, from intellectual property rights to war crimes. She received an undergraduate degree in journalism from the University of Arkansas, her JD from the University of Arkansas, Fayetteville, LaFleur Law Center, and her PhD is from the University College in London. Pruitt is working on a book now about what experience of migrating from the working class to the credentialed class, from red America to blue America, reveals about political polarization. It will be published by W.W. Norton and Company next year, 2024. 2 years, 2024. Please join me now in welcoming to the Westminster Town Hall Forum, Lisa Pruitt.
Well, thank you for that very generous introduction and warm welcome. It is an absolute pleasure to be with you here in Minneapolis. I am a huge fan of Minnesota. I think I've sort of long been a Minnesotan wannabe. My mother-in-law was raised in Cloquet, Minnesota, which I'm sure some of you will know, and I clerked for the 8th Circuit when I was a baby lawyer. So I got to come for court week in St. Paul several times. All right, I'm going to begin with a story. About 6 years ago, in early 2017, I was giving a talk to students and faculty at my law school, UC Davis. It was a talk based on an academic paper I had written, and the paper was about an industrial hog farm, a concentrated animal feeding operation. Probably some of you Minnesotans know about CAFOs. This one was sited in a high-poverty county in the rural South. I launched into my presentation with a description of how the stinky, noxious, 6,500 hog factory factory had come into being. It seemed as if the two hog barns, together the size of a football field and a half, had appeared nearly overnight beside a pristine stream called Big Creek. There, the white metal behemoths sat just a few months after the State Environmental Quality Department had issued a permit for them. Under a new administrative process, bureaucrats had granted the permit with no local notice to the community, no opportunity to express opposition or to try to stop construction of the barns or the accompanying manure lagoons. The community where the hog factory had been built was the poorest corner of a poor county nestled within a poor state. To illustrate and detail that poverty and vulnerability, I marshaled US Census Bureau data. Nearly a quarter of the county's residents lived below the poverty line, and the child poverty rate was higher still, both at least 50% greater than the national averages. Less than 13% of county residents held at least a bachelor's degree, well under half the national level. And the median household income was about $30,000, barely half the national figure. The data on the community immediately surrounding the hog barns was even more devastating. Nearly half of those in the township were living below the poverty line, and the whole operation sat just a few hundred yards from the K-12 school that served the community, where the vast majority of kids received free or reduced price lunches. In short, I was painting a picture of a vulnerable community, one that was crying out for law's protection in the face of what we academics call a polluting externality. My audience was sure to be enraged, I thought, that the groundwater that fed the wells for the entire community was being contaminated via the region's porous karst limestone. They would find disturbing the thought of dried swine feces sprayed on a field across the creek from the school playground. Not only were the images disgusting, but scientific studies showed that CAFOs like these undermine the health of entire neighborhoods. But then I introduced in my talk a variable that proved to be a game changer for at least one person in my audience, perhaps others. I mentioned that the community where the hog factory was sited was a white community. This hog factory was in a persistent poverty county in the Arkansas Ozarks. I had no sooner disclosed that this was happening in a white community than one of my faculty colleagues blurted out, without even raising his hand, "Why should I care about these people who put Trump in the White House? They're exercising power over California and me." Now, admittedly, this was in late January 2017, a few days after Donald Trump was inaugurated the 45th president. Tensions between coastal elites, the world in which I now live, and the flyover states, the world that raised me, were running especially high. So I was stunned by the interruption, but I was not entirely surprised by the sentiment. It was a harsher, blunter version of what I'd heard frequently during my 2 decades as a California law professor. Rural folks, in particular rural folks who are low income, low education, they're presumed to be a problem. In fact, they are sometimes spoken of in my elite coastal world as the problem. They don't deserve sympathy or law's help, the thinking seems to go. My colleague had, as the saying goes, merely said the quiet part out loud. And I have to admit, I could empathize with my colleague up to a point. What he was agitated about, as his comment indicated, was the outsized political power of rural states, I've got air quotes around that, or what we now call red states. I could empathize with the frustration of once again having someone elected president who had not won the popular vote. That had happened not so long ago in 2000, and 2 other times since the Civil War. But that didn't mean I was on board with saying these folks didn't deserve clean air and water, that we could sacrifice them to corporate greed and malfeasance just because they voted for Trump, or more precisely, were presumed to have voted for Trump. My colleague's attitude was a reflection, of course, of the growing agitation of blue state folks against red state folks in the wake of an election that stunned the smug, typically well-educated and fairly insular progressive class in which I live and work. The truth is, Trump's election, because it was widely attributed to rural voters, brought out the worst in many urban folks, along with coastal elites more generally. Now, maybe this sort of thing is not happening within Minnesota because you have robust and valued components of both rural and urban. Indeed, while Californians might think of you as a flyover state, you'd be redeemed in their eyes for leaning blue, for the dominance of the Twin Cities. And maybe you folks here in the cities are above the sort of behavior that I'm describing. Maybe you don't rag on your neighbors in greater Minnesota, even if maybe some of you in your heart of hearts are thinking of it as lesser Minnesota. I don't know. But after all, you are Minnesota nice, and you might not say it even if you were thinking it. So I suspect that there's some tension between the rural and urban factions here in the land of 10,000 lakes. Maybe that's one reason I received this lovely invitation to be with you today. Because some of the folks here at the Westminster Town Hall Forum think that this is a rift that needs to be mended, a chasm that is widening and could use some bridging. Whether or not you are keeping your uncharitable comments to yourself, I think it's fair to say that attitudes like my colleagues are pretty common these days. I'll just call that story I led with Exhibit A. Well, exhibits B, C, D, E, F, and so forth through the alphabet several times of urban antipathy to the rural, and presumably vice versa, though I don't hear the other side of it because of the increasingly narrow media echo chamber that I inhabit. These can be found in mainstream media and certainly in my own social media feeds. Indeed, one of these exhibits even used the term rural bashing, which is the term I've adopted for this phenomenon. It was a tweet from a UC Berkeley lecturer down the road from me, a guy who in November 2019 wrote, "I unironically embrace the bashing of rural Americans. They, as a group, are bad people who have made bad life decisions, and we should shame people who aren't pro-city." Whatever pro-city means. And this was interestingly reminiscent of a bit of rural bashing that arose out of the 2008 presidential contest, the first round of active rural bashing I lived through, as an adult anyway, because of Sarah Palin's association with rural America. This prior comment that reminded me of the Berkeley professors happened when Michael Katz, a former FCC commissioner, said in 2009 regarding broadband expansion, which was being debated in the context of stimulus funding early in Obama's presidency, the notion that we should be helping people who live in rural areas avoid the costs they impose on society is misguided from an efficiency point of view and an equity one. Other people won't say it, but I will. And guess what? More than a decade after Michael Katz said that, 3.7 million rural folks still don't have broadband. The Berkeley professor was speaking about healthcare costs, suggesting that urban folks might have to bear some of the costs of rural folks' healthcare. So both the Berkeley professor, the Berkeley lecturer Kernian, and Katz, the FCC commissioner, were suggesting another concern that urban folks articulate about the rural. One in addition to this undue political heft that is associated with the Electoral College and the Senate. This second concern is that urban taxes subsidize rural needs, a topic that I'll be returning to. You'll also find contemporary rural bashing in response to essays about rural topics in mainstream media outlets like the New York Times. For example, in December of last year, Steve Bullock, until earlier in 2021, the governor of Montana, published an essay in the Times headlined, "I was governor of Montana. My fellow Democrats, you need to get out of the city more." Now, by the way, I'm going to lapse into talking Democrat and Republican here. I know we're trying to be in a nonpartisan forum, but you are having the Attorney General from a Democratic administration here in a few weeks. So maybe you'll let me get away with this. And it's really not feasible for me to avoid naming political parties in this conversation because rural, as illustrated by my colleague's comment back in 2017, has gotten conflated with white and Republican in the national imaginary, and the Democratic Party has been conflated with urban and well-educated and multiracial, although we know that there are stereotypes, right, embedded in these conflations. None of it is quite that simple. So here's what Bullock wrote. To overcome these obstacles, he said, Democrats need to show up, listen, and respect rural voters by finding common ground instead of talking down to them. The core problem is a familiar one, he said. Democrats are out of touch with the needs of the ordinary voter. It's time for Democrats to get uncomfortable and go beyond friendly urban and suburban settings to hear directly from folks in small towns who are trying to run a business, pay the bills, maintain access to health care. They have stories to tell and ideas to share, and we should listen. Note this recurring call to listen. Now, I don't know what you're thinking as I read those excerpts from Bullock's essay, but I didn't find the column to be offensive, quite the contrary. As a self-proclaimed ruralist, I was heartened by it and glad the New York Times gave Bullock a platform. I was glad he was educating readers about the struggles facing rural America, sharing specific data points about the dearth of childcare in rural places. Just 1 in 9 rural children have a childcare space. And 1 in 8 rural Americans lacks health insurance. And a full quarter of rural Americans are spending more than half of their income on rent. I was happy to see him making the point that many rural folks' concerns are the same as urban folks' concerns: jobs, healthcare, educational opportunities, broadband. So I was surprised when so many commenters on Bullock's essay pushed back in ways that were basically shooting the messenger. Bullock was talking about the way the world is, not necessarily how he or any of us want it to be. But most of the readers didn't seem to grasp that. The desire seemed to be primarily to put rural folks in their place. And I was disappointed that so many pushed back in ways that denigrated rural folks, calling them country bumpkins and ignorant homeschoolers and illiterates and deplorables and left behinds, narrow-minded, embodying sheer stupidity and beyond reach and hope. Then there is the perennial favorite that they vote against their own interests. One reader, Patrick in Dallas, wrote, "Can I play devil's advocate here? Maybe the rural voter needs to live in the city for a year or two. Maybe the ordinary voter is an urban dweller. I've personally gotten tired of the real America narrative. It's as if the rest of us are fake Americans." Now, let me interject here. This is a common dialogue. This is a common trope, right, that we see around this rural-urban divide. These protestations about who's a real American, who's ordinary, who's authentic, who's regular, blah, blah, blah. My response is just a very brief: we need to treat everybody as a real American and not get sucked into this really counterproductive discussion. So there's, in a nutshell, Patrick concluded, this is why the Republican voter, this is why rural voters vote Republican, right? Because they've been convinced that city dwellers are evil, condescending, and they want to change rural lifestyles. Now, interestingly, Patrick's comment was designated a Times pick, which means it was pretty tame compared to a lot of the other comments that I saw. That said, Patrick in Dallas seemed not to realize that he might be living up to the Republican-created stereotype, which he had just criticized, of the condescending urbanite who wanted to change rural lifestyles. Sadly, this sort of urban on rural animus doled out by Patrick from Dallas and many, many others is a common response to essays about rural America that we see in mainstream media outlets. What I see much less is thoughtful reflection about what has been happening to rural people and places. What is relatively rare these days is earnest engagement with what people like Bullock are trying to tell us, that rural folks are hurting, their concerns are similar to those of urban dwellers, and we ought, at a very minimum, to be talking to them, not at them. We really need to listen to them. So, as many will have gathered already, commenters on Bullock's essay and many other items I see in my Twitter feed express agitation with rural America on 3 bases. The first I've already mentioned, and that was the focus of my colleague's comment about the people suffering because of the hog farm. They have too much political power because of these institutions of the US Senate and the Electoral College, hence the conclusion by my colleague and many in the media that they put Trump in the White House. 2, they get an unfair portion of federal government spending. And 3, based on the above, we can justify calling them names and asserting their ignorance and generally putting them and their lifestyle down. Now, the first 2 of these things we ought to talk about. Actually, we ought to talk about all 3, but I'm going to start with the first 2. And we ought to talk about them in more concrete terms. We need, I believe, to avoid buzzwords. The buzzwords that I hear are things like minority rule and subsidies, because we don't necessarily have shared definitions of what these terms mean. Regarding the first complaint, the disproportionate rural political power because of the Electoral College and the US Senate, these structures baked into our founding documents, our nation's founding documents, we should keep in mind that abolishing these institutions is going to be very, very, very hard, if not impossible. Plus, it's going to get harder and harder to do precisely because people in states with small populations are going to fight it more and more vigorously the more that they feel their power slipping away, that they feel like they don't have enough power as it is. They're going to cling to whatever power they have, and feeling threatened is really not going to do any good. Further, and this is really important, we should be honest about the impact of the Electoral College, about the impact that it actually has on who becomes president. Yes, it's frustrating. Again, I agree that the person who wins the popular vote does not become president, but that is more attributable to the winner-take-all feature of all states except Maine and Nebraska than it is to the fact that low-population states have a disproportionate number of votes in the Electoral College. The second issue we hear lots of urban complaints about, often framed again as subsidies, burst into the media late last week. How current my talk is, right? When 2 political scientists published a Washington Post essay about their empirical work on the effect that this bad-mouthing, this thing that I call rural bashing, is having on rural voters. Among other things, the scholars, Cal Muniz and Nicholas Jacobs, found that rural voters care about what we might call geographic inequity. The idea that rural areas receive less than their fair share from the government, are ignored by politicians, and are mocked and derided in popular culture. So rural folks think they aren't getting their fair share of federal dollars. Urban folks think rural folks are getting more than their fair share of federal dollars, which raises the question, what is a fair share and how should we measure it? Which it seems to me is the conversation that we should be having, and I'll come back to that in a moment. Well, Paul Krugman of the New York Times was so angered about this Washington Post piece reporting on rural people's feelings that he dashed off a column about how wrong, how off base their feelings are. He even put the word feelings and the word facts to contrast it in the headline of the essay, or the headline writers did. He asserted that the facts show that rural folks get more than their fair share, which is what most urban folks think, more than they pay into federal coffers. Now, the problem is that he was not only condescending about rural folks' feelings, I'm afraid, his analysis was actually fairly superficial. I can't believe I'm publicly criticizing Paul Krugman. Among other shortcomings, it reported federal money flowing back to states as the unit of analysis. That's what we legal geographers call scale, as if entire states are rural. So he conflated low population states with rurality and failed to account for what happens within states. He also neglected to point out that a lot of subsidies in the Farm Bill, perhaps the original use of the word subsidies in this context, do not go to rural communities. They don't go to the farmers who live in rural communities, but rather they go to absentee landowners in cities. So rural communities are not actually getting this money. Other funds flowing to states are social safety net transfers like Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, SNAP, disability. But keep in mind, and Krugman did acknowledge this, that rural people tend to be poorer, they are more likely to be disabled, and they generally have less economic opportunity. But Krugman wasn't talking about economic development. He wasn't talking about investments in roads and bridges. And what about broadband and the fact that there's still 3.7 million rural Americans that still don't have it? In short, there's more than one way to slice and dice these funds to say what is a fair share. In fact, according to other analysis, rural folks are getting too small a piece of the rural pie. But Krugman bolstered the widespread assumption that rural folks do get more, even though his analysis is, I would say, somewhat superficial. And that's just fueling urban animus and resentment. So we really have to, I think we'd be well advised to talk more concretely rather than use actually fairly inflammatory words like subsidies. It's become a kind of inflammatory word. So let's talk concretely about the money that is actually going back to rural communities. And then we need to talk about the cost of delivering services to rural communities. It's almost always going to cost more to provide a service that we decide is important, be it a school or a hospital or broadband, because you can't achieve economies of scale to deliver services in rural communities. So we have to think about whether we value what it is that we get from rural people and places so we can make informed decisions about what is appropriate. So this might prompt us to make an inventory of the things we value about rural people and places, like the fact that they typically feed us, they supply energy. Rural sociologists often talk in terms of food, fuel, and fiber, as well as fishing, farming, and forests. In addition, I hope we're increasingly aware that most of us want to consume the rural. Here in Minnesota, you boast your 10,000 lakes and your world-famous boundary waters. And of course, you not only enjoy these natural amenities, they're an important part of your state's economy. So I hope you're getting a clearer picture of what I think is a more useful way to have these conversations. But here's the bottom line. Well, I should say one more thing before I get to my bottom line. Maybe if we were having more constructive conversations about political power and whether rural people or urban people are getting their fair share, it would stem some of the rural bashing, right? Because if we could all sort of get on the same page and reach some tentative conclusions about what's appropriate, then we wouldn't be treating rural people with so much contempt and anger. Because the contempt and the anger are not serving city folks well, and they're certainly not serving rural folks well. So maybe it's time to take a different tack. To quote a 2017 Roger Cohen column from the New York Times, getting America out of this mess begins with an acknowledgement that New York and California don't have a stranglehold on the truth any more than Kansas and Missouri do. Or here in Minnesota, we might say, you might say, getting Minnesota out of this mess, if in fact you are in a mess, begins with acknowledging that Minneapolis and St. Paul do not have a stranglehold on truth any more than Cloquet and Mankato do. So shouldn't we really just give the rural bashing a rest? Or if you're in a rural area listening to this and you've been urban bashing and you know who you are, shouldn't you be giving the urban bashing a rest? So you invited me here to talk about how to heal this house divided, so here's my big idea beyond what I've already told you. What if we treated the relationship between rural and urban, what I see is the interdependence of the two, like other relationships that we value. Say, like our familial relationships, or our relationship with a spouse or a life partner, a relationship with a family member. I've had this framework rolling around in my head for a while now, and as a serious-minded law professor, I'm really going out on a limb here, but here it is. Everything I need to know about coalition building, I learned in family therapy. What if we took the expertise on the family as an ecosystem and applied it to other relationships? Like relationships with folks we have constructed as somehow being our political enemies. Any family therapist will tell you that a family is a system and no one member is all to blame when something is going wrong. And if we care about keeping a family together, we know it's going to take work, it's going to take compromise, everyone will have a role. It's going to take empathic listening, active listening, and it's going to require a commitment to the relationship. People are going to want to have to be in the relationship. I often find myself reflecting on the advice I received about 20 years ago when I was about to marry. One really precious bit that I often revisit came from an Iowan who happened to be the best man, who happened to be our best man. So he must be wise, right? Because he's from Iowa. Anyway, he had a long-standing marriage, and my husband and I really admired his marriage. And our friend Dennis often said that you have to ask yourself, do you want to be right or do you want to be happy? Do you want to be right or do you want to stay married? And let me tell you, I'm a lawyer and I really like being right. So this has been really helpful advice for me, right? I sometimes think that urban folks are more interested in being right than in building coalitions. And the same may be true of rural people. We're too wrapped up in proving our way is better. Rural folks are takers that we subsidize. Rural folks vote against their own interests, that we lose sight of the need to build coalitions to respond to our shared cross-cutting problems. By the way, just last week on the Pod Save America podcast, Barack Obama again talked about the importance of coalition building. Maybe some of you read some of the excerpts about, that were also published about 2 weeks ago of the manuscript that he wrote when he was in law school that was never published. And it's a big, big focus on coalition building, as messy and as hard as it is. My favorite expert on marriage, other than my friend Dennis, is Dr. John Gottman, who runs a famous love lab. Gottman talks in terms of the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse that signal the likely failure of a marriage: defensiveness, stonewalling, criticism versus complaint, which is okay, but worst of all is disdain. And disdain is what I hear and see when lots of urban folks talk about rural people, calling them ignorant, insular, horrible people, even saying that they deserve to die. Many urban folks are not even trying to listen. They're not trying to be in dialogue. What I hear is contempt, and contempt is deadly to a marriage. A marriage cannot survive contempt. So if our goal is to build coalitions, the coalitions that are going to be necessary to solve the cross-cutting problems associated with both rural and urban places, it's going to require it's going to require convincing people that we've got some good ideas, right? So we might think about how to do that most effectively, and it's pretty clear that name-calling isn't doing the trick. So as if this talk hasn't been all over the place already with a little law, a little policy, some psychotherapy, now I'm going to swerve to pop theology. I I was very taken with this passage from the book, Wholehearted Faith. Feminist theologian Rachel Held Evans' posthumously published book this year, where she wrote about the best way to persuade someone of the correctness of your position. Sociologists tell us that winning an argument is actually a terrible way to change someone's mind. Winning, in other words, isn't really winning, at least if one's goal is conversion. In fact, it tends to produce the opposite of our desired effect, because when people feel that their worldview is being threatened, they become protective and defensive, digging in their proverbial heels even more. As moral psychologist Jonathan Haidt explains so brilliantly in The Righteous Mind, people are far more likely to be persuaded when they feel seen and heard, when they believe their own argument has been fairly presented, and when they are confronted with a story. It seems that rural America and urban America have lost touch with each other, and they're going to need to get reacquainted. And that's going to require a lot of empathic listening to each other's stories. I want to close with a vignette of someone who has really inspired me in recent months. Mary Peltola was recently elected to Congress from Alaska. She is the first Alaska Native to serve in Congress. Oh, and by the way, she beat Sarah Palin, and she's running against Sarah Palin again this fall because the term she has now is just the end of Don Young's term. So she's running for a full term in the election in a couple of weeks. Now, Peltola is from a part of Alaska that is very rural. Bethel and the massive Kuskokwim Delta, I'm sure I just mispronounced that. And she often mentions rural Alaska in her campaign messaging. She also often talks in terms of the needs of normal Alaskans and regular Alaskans. And interestingly, when she does it, I haven't seen pushback. Maybe because she's a Democrat, maybe because she's an Alaska Native, I don't know. But I think her campaigning and her stances are very unifying. And she gives credit for that to her heritage. Peltola said last month, "My hope is to take the values of collaboration and peacemaking. I hope that I can reflect those. Those are the values I was raised with." As a Yupik from rural Western Alaska, Peltola says she's been taught to consider community harmony and being part of something larger. She says she's proud of her ethnicities, all of them, and she often points out that her dad is a white guy from Nebraska. On the eve of her swearing in, Peltola said in an interview, "You talk about one group having suffered more than another group, and I think that it's important in America that we're not trying to one-up each other on our level of suffering." Peltola likes to say that no American is her enemy. Her radical moderation apparently hasn't dampened enthusiasm for her among Alaskans. And maybe that radical moderation can be a model for all of us.
Thank you, Lisa Pruitt. This is the Westminster Town Hall Forum coming to you from Westminster Presbyterian Church in downtown Minneapolis. I'm Tim Hart Anderson, Senior Minister here at Westminster and moderator of the forum. Our guest today is Lisa Pruitt, speaking on mending the rural-urban rift. If you're here in the sanctuary, we invite you to write a question on a card and hold it up for our ushers to collect. And if you're watching online, please put your questions into the chat. And while the ushers begin collecting questions, I'd like to thank our broadcast partner, Minnesota Public Radio. NPR will broadcast this fall's forums as a special week of programming starting December 5. One program from Healing Our House Divided will air each day at noon the first week of December, including a live broadcast of our Thursday, December 8th forum. And thanks to our other media partners, MinnPost, a source of nonpartisan news about Minnesota and beyond. Find their coverage, including a series they ran last week on the rural-urban rift at minnpost.com. And thanks to Sahan Journal, which provides coverage of Minnesota immigrants and communities of color. Learn more at sahanjournal.com. A reminder that both MinnPost and Sahan Journal are set up outside the sanctuary today, so take a moment to stop by their tables. Also, a free breads and spreads reception in Westminster Hall awaits all of us. After today's program, these receptions follow every program, so please join us in person at our next forum. And now, Professor Pruitt, if you are ready, I will present the questions from the audience. First question has to do with how often you are invited by rural communities to speak on the rural-urban divide.
I don't think I've ever been invited to speak
That's what I thought.
by a rural community. I will tell you that some of the written advocacy that I have done has apparently not landed well with all rural dwellers. A piece that I co-authored early in the Biden presidency about, it was one of those 5 things the Biden administration should do for rural America. And among other things, my co-authors and I, talked about broadband and so forth. And there were a few commentators out of many who said, who are these, urban elites? What do they know? So, in fact, my 2 other colleagues actually had fairly decent rural, field cred too, but that didn't percolate through to the reader, I guess.
We Minnesotans are aware that today is the 20th anniversary of Paul Wellstone's death. And we are remembering how well he connected. He was an academic, how well he connected from the Twin Cities area to the Iron Range and beyond. And I'm wondering, and you've given us one illustration of an Alaskan politician. Are there other places where politicians are having some success at connecting across this divide?
Yeah, that's a great question. I am a huge fan of Jon Tester, Senator Jon Tester from Montana. I think he and Mary Peltola have different styles, but their Twitter feeds are very clever. And I hope and think that they're very effective. Tester is extremely tuned in to rural communities, speaking about specific rural communities frequently. When he talks about the infrastructure funding, there's some project he talks about frequently. It's like the Milk River water, something. And this must mean something in Montana. But what I like is the specificity. He's often talking about what specific communities are getting. He also talks a lot about the fact that rural schools cannot survive vouchers and charter schools. So he wrote about that in his book too, which I loved, Grounded, which was published a few years ago, an excellent book. And he talks about a number of positions that, a number of sort of policy proposals like, charter schools that just will devastate rural communities. And we're seeing a lot of that in this election cycle as well. We're seeing it in Oklahoma, we're seeing it in Missouri, where there are apparently these fairly robust moves to effectively defund rural schools, which is going to, of course, decimate rural communities, because once you don't have the school, you lose the post office and the grocery store, and maybe you already lost your hospital. So, yeah, those are some models.
Here's a question about how to balance the calling out of very real threats to our democracy, much of which is happening in more rural settings, attacks on voting rights and refusing to recognize the majority rule. How do you balance that out with the kind of bridge building you're talking about here?
That is such an important question, and obviously it's a very, very difficult sort of line to draw. Yes, I too am very, very concerned about the very real threats that exist, many of which are percolating up in rural communities and appear to be, by some indications, becoming more robust. But I also believe that there is still a middle, and that it is extremely important not to push people who are still in the middle into that camp that is farther right, so far right as to be dangerous. And I fear that much of the language and the rhetoric is so alienating. You know, I think about the people, you know, I often talk in terms of the people who raised me versus, you know, the people where I live and work now. And the people who raised me were, you know, they were good people. And they have, in many instances, you know, suffered through economic decline. And they, it's almost impossible not to talk about race, right, in this conversation, because race has become such a huge part of the conflict, as I, you know, at least touched on in my talk. So the people who raised me, you know, espoused colorblindness. The church in which I grew up espoused, you know, colorblindness. Well, now in urban settings, we see colorblindness as passé and not feasible because we've had exposure to a lot of exposure, oftentimes many years of exposure to ideas like implicit bias and structural racism. But those are abstractions that people with less formal education have not necessarily been brought along with. And so it is very alienating when, you know, elites just talk glibly as if everyone understands, you know, structural racism. And the foundation for these concepts has not been laid in rural communities. And in many cases, they're very proud of being colorblind, which is far better than what we're seeing a resurgence of everywhere, which is what political scientists call old-fashioned racism. So, you know, maybe we need to think of this as a continuum and not make people, you know, feel awful for espousing colorblindness. And if we feel that colorblindness is not good enough, then we have to figure out how to have conversations, how to help people understand concepts like structural racism, which really are very abstract.
I know in rural Minnesota communities, especially in the southwestern part of the state, there's a lot of immigration happening. And so previously small white communities find themselves with 20, 30, 40%, what we would call in the cities, people of color living among them. Is this a phenomenon? I know it's happening in Nebraska and other rural areas. Is a phenomenon actually having an impact on the perspective perhaps of some rural residents about urban life? Yeah. Interestingly, the most recent census shows that 1 in 4 people living in rural America is now a person of color. The last census, I believe it was 1 in 5. So we have what you're describing in southwestern Minnesota, in Nebraska. We have it in northwest Arkansas, where I grew up. These are called new immigrant destinations, right? Immigrants used to stay mostly in gateway states and gateway cities, and they're now spreading across the country in rural communities. And in some places, it's been very, very good for many rural communities because it's been an economic salvation. Not only because they're coming to do work that a lot of people no longer want to do or are willing to do in these communities, like in the meatpacking industry, but also they're doing service work. And so in some instances, this has been very positive also because the exposure to people of color in previously all-white communities actually turns out to be a great thing. If you've never seen, that is, the white communities, the receiving communities are very receptive. A great example of this is illustrated in the documentary Postville. It's about the Postville raid in Iowa. It's a really, really fabulous depiction of how this, previously essentially all-white community had so embraced the Hispanic workforce and the other people of color who had come into their community that when the federal immigration raid occurred, there was this enormous, rallying around that community. But there are
what you can consider growing pains in these communities too. Sure.
Like you, I too was born in a small town, Midwestern town in the center of Kansas, Ellsworth, Kansas. Its main claim to fame was a 19th century labeling of Ellsworth as the wildest town on the cattle drive north. It has since slowly been in decline, and we visit every few years, and recently as this last summer. There's a sense of, I guess I would say, sorrow laying over the town. And I'm wondering to what extent do you find that grief over what used to be is an active factor in your view of what's going on between cities and rural areas?
Yeah, I think it's huge. Some people say, and I have some, I tend to think this may be correct, that the most important word in Make America Great Again is the again, that it is nostalgia for a past, for a different time that has driven some, maybe a lot of Trumpism, and it's driving this grief and this desperation. I was on a radio talk show shortly after Trump was elected, and one of the callers, it was a national program, and one of the callers was a farmer, and his attitude was, if I can't keep what I've had, I'm struggling to hang on as a farmer, and if I can't hang on to, what I've had, if I can't survive as a farmer, then basically I'm willing, to burn it all down. And I fear that many people were willing to take a chance on Trump and Trumpism and what that represents because they could no longer hold their own. So there is a lot of grief, there is a lot of sorrow as communities suffer population loss.
You used the phrase rural lifestyle in your remarks, maybe unintentionally, but it reminds me of how people used to talk about the gay lifestyle. And suddenly you discover that there isn't just one. So what did you mean when you said rural lifestyle?
Oh, goodness. I think I'm running out of time. No, seriously, there's an old saying among rural sociologists, and even though I'm a law professor, I've been hanging out with rural sociologists since 2008. And, there's an old adage among rural sociologists, if you've seen one rural place, you've seen one rural place. So it is, in fact, very hard to generalize. The very first law review article I wrote about rural stuff was basically, among other things, featured judicial and legislative depictions of what they thought rural meant. And gosh, there's one, I wish I had the exact quote in front of me now, but it was from the West Virginia Supreme Court. It was a fairly old case from the 1970s, and it was something in the context of schools. And the West Virginia Supreme Court defined rural as people living in country places and doing country things. And so it was all very circular, right? But some of the features of a rural lifestyle, some of the sort of hallmarks that crop up in my own writing are attachment to place. These are some markers of rural life. Extraordinary attachment to place. Sometimes that's attachment to land. Sometimes it's attachment to the community. It's about reliance on kith and kin, reliance on neighbors, reliance on informal networks. And when I think back on my own upbringing, that was such an important part of it. I'm the fifth generation on both my mother's and my father's side of the family to grow up in the same county of 8,000 people. And when I read my mother's journal, she was going to night school when my sister and I were, 6, 7, and 8. And every entry, right, is who kept us 12 different people over the course of all these years, and the reliance on the people in the community. And so attachment to place, I think, is incredibly powerful in, various manifestations. Lack of anonymity, right? So we in cities tend to get to walk around and be fairly anonymous, but the lack of anonymity in rural places, the being known, has both, positive and negative consequences.
You advocated you advocate a conversation with rural people for those of us who live in cities. One of our listeners asks, where would this conversation take place? Maybe at a Perkins in Maple Grove. Actually, Maple Grove is too close. Think Bemidji or someplace Eveleth or something like that. But where could this conversation take place that you're advocating for?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. I know Minnesota Public Radio interviewed me and this fabulous rural sociologist named Loka Ashwood back, I don't know, a month, 6 weeks ago. And then the journalist who did the interview was going on the road to do kind of a rural listening tour.
Carrie Miller, yeah.
Yes, thank you, Carrie Miller. And I'm forgetting the name. I think St. Cloud was one of the places.
Mm-hmm.
I'm forgetting the names of the others. By the way, my husband's father's family, my husband's mother grew up in Cloquet, but my husband's father's family has roots in St. Cloud. So that one I cling to.
Well, we have just a couple more minutes here. I'm wondering if you could take us to a place of hope around this divide that we've been focusing on today, because it seems to many of us, I would say, intractable, irreconcilable, a bridge that cannot be built. Get us to a place with a little more hope about healing this house divided, the rural-urban rift.
Boy, I am putting a lot on Mary Peltola's shoulders. But Mary Peltola and the response that she seems to elicit in people gives me enormous hope. Because, right, she's got multiple hats on here. She is rural, and she is Alaska Native. She is a bridge builder. And I fear that a lot of the negativity that, and this is probably evident from my talk, right? A lot of the negativity that urban folks direct at rural folks is because of this stereotype of the rural white Trump supporter, or a person who doesn't have much formal education, and whose political leanings are now officially in, this very negative camp. So when people like Mary Peltola, and in many ways, actually, the folks you were talking about earlier, right? The Hispanic and the Asian refugees who are coming into places, and the African refugees who are coming into places to do work in rural communities. These people are bridge builders. And so when we look to someone like Mary Peltola and what she represents, she has a great opportunity to be a bridge builder, with the caveat that we can't let her and her people down. We can't just use her as an Alaska Native. We have to make a commitment to her and her people. We've really been remiss in talking about, Native communities who also often have outsized presences in rural places. So I think on the one hand, she's this symbolic bridge builder, but let's be sure that we don't use her and then not give back to her communities what it is that they deserve.
Thank you for ending on that hopeful note. We're listening to Lisa Pruitt. Thanks very much for your presentation at the Town Hall Forum. Well done. This isn't for public radio's consumption, but she confessed to me before coming in here that she's a member of Westminster Presbyterian Church in Sacramento, California. So, yeah. Lisa, thank you very much for being with us today. We want to encourage all of you now to head out to the tables with Minpost and Sahan, and also join us in Westminster Hall for some breads and spreads. Thank you for coming today to the Town Hall Forum. See you next time. Good on your feet.
Okay?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, great.
Good, very good.
Hi.